I want to introduce our first speaker. This is Professor Doug Kriner. Doug is also a member of the Faculty in Residence program, and there's a talk that he's going to give tentatively titled Hail to the Pork, the Presidency and Inequality. What he's talking about in part is challenging conventional wisdom that presidents try to balance out particularistic impulses of members of Congress and instead are focused on the national interest and maximum efficiency. Every president since Washington has made this claim. Instead, he's going to talk about or show us that presidents engage in pork barrel politics to an even greater extent than members of Congress, giving money to constituents, etc. So with that said, I want to make sure that I introduce Professor Kriner. He is an associate professor of political science, and he's also the director of undergraduate studies. He attended 2 universities, neither of which I've heard about before. They seem sort of inconsequential. One is this place called Harvard across the river. That's where he did his PhD, and he did his undergraduate at MIT, so he's a real scholar. He's written a couple books recently. One is called The Causality Gap, The Cases and Consequences of American Military Policymaking. The second is After the Rubicon, Congress, Presidents, and the Politics of Waging War. His work has appeared in several prominent journals, read by scholars all over the world. Some of the most prominent opinion leaders in the country and in the world have read and referenced his work. You can find his work in the Journal of Politics, the British Journal of Political Science, Legislative Studies Quarterly, as well as interestingly enough, a Boston University Law Review article. He's an expert on the presidency. He's an expert on Congress. He's an expert on domestic politics. He's also an expert in terms of statistics and quantitative methods, as well as the separation of powers. And most interesting to me, he's an expert on the use of force. So with that said, thank you so much for coming out tonight, and I'd like to introduce our first speaker.
So, good evening, everyone, and apologies for my voice. I normally sound a little bit better. My name is Doug Kriner. I'm in the Political Science Department, and welcome to your first government shutdown in T-minus 4 hours, 35 minutes. I was in high school when I got to experience my first shutdown. You guys were non-cognizant, probably in elementary school, or no, I think probably more like kindergarten or preschool. So, this will be fun. Before getting to sort of the meat of the talk today, which is a little bit about my next book project, I thought I'd take a few moments just to talk about our current fiscal mess. Because, hey, if you're giving a talk about presidential budgetary politics, I can start to see you in the back already sort of drifting off into a nice, warm, deep sleep. There's something that has to happen to make budgetary politics sexy, and shutdowns are it, right? So if you've watched any bit of the stuff on the news, we are going to be more screwed than we were in the 90s. And just real fast, why that is so. Back in 1995, 96, when it was Bill Clinton and Newt Gingrich going mano a mano, we had actually, believe it or not, back in the 90s, we used to do things called pass budgets. We haven't passed a budget in this country in years. So we've got a number of appropriation bills, a little over a dozen. We had passed 7 or 8 of them at the time the government shut down. So when we said we had a shutdown in the 90s, only part of the federal government didn't show up for work the next day. What's going to happen tomorrow is that everybody who's non-essential doesn't show up for work tomorrow, once the House and the Senate can't agree to pass what's called a continuing resolution to keep the government funded at its own levels. So that's one way in which our current mess is a lot different than what it was before. The other aspect of the politics that I just find so interesting is that this battle over the budget isn't about the budget. That's unbelievably bizarre in so many levels, right? But essentially, back in the 90s, what we had is sort of, a president, Bill Clinton, who one of his first major acts in power was to halve the deficit. Something called the Deficit Reconciliation Act of 1993, passed without a single Republican vote. In fact, when they finally twisted the last arm I sort of remember this. And they twisted the last arm, the woman that cast the vote was booed and hissed at from the other side of the aisle, saying, see you later, Marjorie, because you'll lose your seat over this. And she did. And Chelsea Clinton ended up marrying her son, which is sort of, an interesting bit of political nepotism in the end. But in any event, so you had a president with deficit-cutting credentials, but then you had a new speaker, Newt Gingrich, who wanted to slash the budget even more. And he thought that he could extract more concessions from the president in terms of reducing federal spending significantly. And Clinton finally said no, and Gingrich decided to call his bluff. And Clinton vetoed the Republicans' appropriations bills and shut the government down. This time, we are brought to the brink of a shutdown, even though one side of the aisle is going to get exactly what it wants in terms of the budget. Actually, that's not quite fair. I'd say about half of the Republican Party would love things to stay as they are with the sequester. Keep all of it, right? Another half would like to keep all of the domestic cuts but restore the military cuts. And Democrats would like to get rid of all of them, all of the cuts, domestic and military. If they just passed the CR, right? You would get the biggest bit of budget reduction possible. Just by agreeing to continue funding at current levels, all of the sequester stays. Democrats get nothing of what they want. So it seems to be a real winning situation for Republicans. But instead, this budget shutdown is all about Obamacare. And the great irony is when the government shuts down tomorrow morning, absolutely nothing happens to Obamacare. You can go onto the exchanges online, you can sign up, and even the subsidies that you're going to get, which are really important for you as young people, maybe not now when you're on BU's insurance or your parents' insurance until you're 26, but when you are striking on your own and you might need a government subsidy, that money is totally off budget as well. It's a guarantee. So nothing about this actually stops Obamacare, but we're shutting down the government in the name of stopping Obamacare, which is a little weird. And so I'm happy to answer any questions you might have about that kind of stuff, because these are really fascinating times for you to be in college and thinking about this stuff and forming some of your political opinions about how policymakers in Washington should behave. So with that out of the way, let me get to the topic of this project just a little bit. So I call it Hail to the Pork, Presidents and the Politics of Federal Spending. So when you think about pork barrel politics, I don't know about you, but I think of stuff like the bridge to nowhere. Here's this bridge, tens of millions of dollars to connect an island in Alaska to the mainland where about 55 people live, right? Why on earth would we do that? Because the chairman of the House Appropriations Subcommittee that deals with these types of things in transportation spending is from Alaska and from that district, and so this is a great way for him to bring home the bacon for his constituents. We use that phrase a lot. We like pork metaphors in American politics and thinking about budgets, and generally we think about members of Congress. And it makes sense, right? Sure, you're a member of the United States Congress, but when it comes to your neck every 2 years, if you're a member of the House, your fate isn't decided by 299.3 million of those Americans, right? It's decided by the 700,000 of them that just so happen to live in your district. So if you're Congressman Capuano across the river, you care a lot about Cambridge, you care a lot about Somerville, and Alston, meh, it doesn't really matter quite as much. Certainly, he doesn't care what happens in Wyoming, right? So members of Congress are really particularistic. So it's long argued in how they think about budgets. Whereas presidents, by contrast, well, they shouldn't be, right? We have a norm in American politics, and it's one that presidents themselves have done a lot to promote, to say that we take a different view precisely because we are the only political actor in our system elected by the nation as a whole. So George Washington, 1795, this is a letter to the selectmen of Boston, writes that in every act of his administration, he sought the happiness of his fellow citizens. And how does he do this? He does it by overlooking all personal, local, and partial considerations to contemplate the United States instead as one great whole, and to consult only the substantial and permanent interests of our country. Fast forward a little bit. Every president says stuff like this. Ronald Reagan. So here he is at a swearing-in ceremony in the old Executive Office Building in 1985 for some of his employees. And he said, "I've often said the only people in Washington who represent all the people are those, basically, who are here in this room. Because we're beholden to no district, beholden to no particular section or state. So what are the implications of this? Who cares about norms after all and whether they're right or wrong? Can't we sort of just live in this fuzzy world in which we sort of hold on to these? Like, well, it leads people to make some really crazy assumptions, and assumptions that can patently be dangerous, I'd like to argue. So here's a quote from a Law Review article that Justice Elena Kagan wrote when she was still across the river at Harvard Law and not yet Justice or Solicitor General Kagan. And so she's thinking here about, from a lawyer's perspective, when it comes to figuring out who should make policy, right? Who should figure out what Obamacare's implementation should look like? Should it be Congress or should it be bureaucrats in the White House? Actually, delegating to the president is a very good thing. Why? Delegating to the president will lead to normatively desirable policy outcomes because the president has a national constituency and he's likely to consider in setting the direction of policy on an ongoing basis the preferences of the general public rather than merely parochial interests. Presidents pursue maximal efficiency. Members of Congress look out for their constituents. So we should want a more powerful presidency. It's going to lead to better outcomes. Is that true? So when presidents run for office, we know that they don't care about us here in Massachusetts. The only reason that we heard anything from Mitt Romney or Barack Obama last time is because New Hampshire's in the Boston media market, right? And New Hampshire was a swing state. But where do candidates camp out? They camp out in swing states. So here's President Obama with some kids, maybe not quite kids, a little bit older than kids, in Columbus, Ohio. They're sort of spelling out Ohio like they're at an OSU game. You know, if you can't quite see it, there it is, right? You know, we know that this is what they do. And people have decried this. Critics of the Electoral College say, look, because it isn't a popular vote, people in Massachusetts, our voice isn't heard in presidential elections. I think that's bad. But what's even scarier is the idea that somehow these sorts of crass electoral calculations affect presidents as governors when they're actually in the act of governing, not just campaigning. So when they're governing, do we see presidents also pandering to swing state voters? Well, we can certainly pick out some anecdotes that would lead Sarah Palin to answer, you betcha. So Washington Post, right, in September of 2012, said Obama showering Ohio with attention and money. Obama said we need to revitalize American manufacturing. So I'm going to create 10 centers, and I'm only going to name one of them right now. Youngstown, Ohio, this is for you, right? One of my favorites, the largest small business association loan in history goes to a ricotta cheese manufacturer in Ohio. The president said this is one of our smartest and tastiest investments in this year's bill. Passenger train service, Democrats love trains. Why not build a new passenger rail line between two cities in Ohio that haven't had it in 60 plus years? That's exactly where we want to be spending our money, right? These are some anecdotes. Do they hold up systematically? And so Professor Downs sort of mentioned that I like statistics. For those of you who have had me, Dan, poor you, you know I like statistics. And I want to show you this is a case where statistics actually can help us answer really interesting normative questions in a social science setting. So we're going to look not just at little anecdotes, but systematically. Do presidents really benefit some states more than others for electoral gain? There's another type of constituency that presidents might like or dislike. And for this, I've got to go with one of our faves, Richard Nixon. So in a memo to his chief domestic policy advisor, John Ehrlichman, Nixon actually said something I can't imagine any other president ever putting down on the record. Post-Watergate, presidents aren't stupid enough to actually leave paper trails like this. But he actually wrote, in your budget plans, I want Missouri, New York, Indiana, Nevada, Wisconsin, and Minnesota to get less than they've gotten in the past. The message can get across that states with Republican senators are going to get a better audience at the White House than those with Democratic senators who are constantly chopping at us. When presidents, are they presidents of the United States of America? You know, Barack Obama's rhetoric, always that, not blue state, red state, this or that. Or are they primarily leaders of their political party? Do they look out for their own core partisan constituencies at the expense of an equitable distribution of federal resources? These are some of the questions that we can answer by looking broadly at how federal dollars are allocated across the country and seeing if it systematically varies with the political characteristics of a constituency. So real fast, in just a couple minutes. A quick initial cut. Nothing fancy here, right? On the x-axis, I've tried to come up with a way of saying which states are more electorally competitive than another. And so what I'm going to use here is how much of the two-party vote share the loser has gotten in the last 3 elections. So if it is a perfectly competitive state, it goes 50-50 every single time, that's your swingest of swing states. If you have one state, you can imagine Utah, where it's sort of always 80-20, 80-20, 80-20. It's going to be relatively uncompetitive. There's a tremendous amount of spread here. If you're a math stats major, you're like, yeah, that's a really weak correlation. If you're a social scientist who tries to understand human behavior, you're like, that's a pretty strong correlation. The slope of the line is very clear, even if there's a lot of scatter around the trend. So it's a sort of a prima facie case that, wow, presidents systematically over 20 plus years of American history seem to give a lot more money to states that are competitive than to those in which the outcome is decided. So finally, one last bit of analysis I like to do is we have some data on how much every single state and every single county in America has gotten from 1984 to 2008. And we divide states into 3 different types: swing states, core states that vote overwhelmingly for the president's party, and then poor Richard Nixon's enemies, who he said he wanted to punish, right? Well, is Nixon alone, or do all presidents have a little inner Nixon sitting on their shoulders, sort of encouraging them to punish political enemies? So here's a real quick first cut. This is how much the average county, just a county, gets if it's in a swing state, it's in a core state, and then we sort of ignore the others for a moment. Being in a swing state gets you about $20 million more every year, just by virtue of being in a swing state. Actually, if Baltimore County, Maryland, were just across the border, across the Mason-Dixon line in Pennsylvania, our model estimates it would get over $50 million more in federal spending every single year. When you start looking at the relatively small cost of a lot of these cuts that are being imposed as a part of the sequester, that's a really significant amount of cash. Also, presidents do sort of systematically seem to reward their partisan allies. Show you one real quick final cut of the data. That is, if presidents are really doing this to try and bolster their chances at re-election, voters, one thing that's pretty remarkable about them is how short their memories are. They sort of forget how things were 2 or 3 years ago. They really remember stuff that happened recently. So if presidents give money to swing states to try and buy votes, not to put too fine a point on it, swing states should get a lot more money, or counties in swing states should get a lot more money in election years. And that's exactly what we find. The average swing state gets $750 million more in federal spending than an equivalently sized state that's not competitive in an election year, according to our model. So where does this leave us? I think it makes us really question whether or not an overly strengthened presidency is normatively a good thing for our polity. Perhaps what we do is we've sort of replaced this congressional pork barrel politics with a totally different type of pork barrel politics. And in fact, if anything, the data suggests that presidents are simply a whole lot better at doing it than members of Congress are. And they really skew these outcomes, creating political inequality in terms of who gets what, in large part because of this weird vestige of American politics that is the Electoral College. So thanks very much. I appreciate your attention. So I think I went over and probably only have time for one question if there is one. And if not, I'll take a seat.
So if the government shuts down at midnight,
Yep.
how long can it be shut down?
Oh, indefinitely. I don't think there's any time limit on that whatsoever. It'll be resolved by the debt ceiling, would be my best guess. I don't think either side is going to be willing to see us default. So, we may be shut down for a little while, but I think it'll be over by the debt ceiling. Yeah. The consequences, we can survive a shutdown. A default, maybe we can survive it, but it's never happened before, and I don't think anyone has any clue what would happen. And that's going to scare even Democrats and Republicans in Congress enough to actually do something. Yeah. All right. Thanks very much.